The word apostle comes from the Greek word apostellein. It means to send. Jesus took these 12 people whom he had formed after his own heart, and then he sent them. The Christian faith is never meant to be held onto as a private privilege. It's meant to be shared, to be spread like seed around the world. And so the apostolic church to the present day still has that great missionary purpose. The God that Jesus consistently proclaimed is a God of tender mercy, a God of gracious love, whose very nature is to give. When I find my deepest center, that place in me where I am here and now being created by God, I've also necessarily found the deepest center of everyone else and everything else in the cosmos. June 2nd, 1979, John Paul II said Mass here in Victory Square. He preached and he spoke of God, of freedom, of human rights. The crowd began to chant, "We want God, we want God." One of Paul's favorite words is dunamis in the Greek, which means power. Dynamite comes from that. And the gospel he keeps saying is dunamis. And so what he was doing, he was walking around this part of the world with dynamite. That's what he was doing. And the dynamite was that God is love and that God has manifested himself in Jesus Christ, risen from the dead. And it's dynamite that will turn the world upside down. The peculiar thing about Christianity, the gospel hinges upon it. Jesus consistently speaks and acts in the very person of God. One day in a hovel in the little nothing town of Nazareth, an angel appeared to a young Israelite girl, perhaps no more than 14 or 15, and they had an extraordinary conversation. Our Lady of Guadalupe became the bearer to this nation, to this people, of the God who orders things not through violence, not through scapegoating, but precisely through love. In the first weeks and months of her new life, Mother Teresa experienced bouts of discouragement and loneliness. But she persevered, and so many of Mother Teresa's former students came to join her here in the slums of Calcutta. Professor Vabil found at the very depth of her soul Christ dwelling in her. And she found that to be a castle. To be grounded in Christ, she realized, was to be grounded in that very power which here and now creates the cosmos, that power which lies beyond the vagaries of space and time. Being itself, God, cannot be grasped, but at the same time, being itself cannot be hidden from. God insinuates himself into every nook and cranny of what he's made. The church father Tertullian said, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians." Is that true in this case? You tell me. The mind, the will, the soul seek a definitive truth, a final good, an absolute beauty. The soul pushes beyond itself toward these transcendent ends. There's a great scene in the Old Testament where the Israelites are doing battle. So the young guys, the soldiers, are out doing battle. But then up on the hillside is Moses, and he has his arms up like this, invoking the aid of God. And then when his arms get tired, his friends come and they hold up his arms. Well, it's a great image of the church. There's the kind of fighting church out there that's in the trenches doing the work of social justice and everything else, caring for the poor and the hungry. But then they're supported by prayer. And then the prayers are supported by people that make their life possible. Think of those who contribute to religious communities and to monasteries and all that. Well, they're the people holding up the arms of the prayers who in turn make the work of the army possible. That's a great image for the church. The whole point is this: the church is not simply a human institution. The church is, as Vatican II said, a sacrament of Jesus. That means it shares in the very being, life, and energy of Christ. Or in that inexhaustibly rich metaphor of St. Paul, the church is the body of Jesus. Not just an institution, not an organization, not a collectivity of like-minded people. The church is an organism made up of interdependent cells and molecules and organs. Think of those wonderful organic images that Jesus uses all the time. I am the vine and you are the branches. Remain in me, live in me. Eat my body and drink my blood. Now, I could be a great admirer of Abraham Lincoln. I could even join the Abraham Lincoln Society. I'd never be tempted for a minute to eat the body and drink the blood of Lincoln. I could admire Gandhi. I could join the Gandhi Society. I'd never be tempted to be grafted onto Gandhi. But we say just those radical things about our relationship to Jesus. Two great biblical images come to mind here. One is from the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. Jesus says, "Whatsoever you do to the least of my people, you do to me." He's not simply saying, when you feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, you're doing something ethically praiseworthy. He's saying you're doing something for me. He's not simply saying when you fail to do those things, you're doing something ethically blameworthy. He's saying you fail to do something to me. That's how intimate the connection is between Christ and his mystical body, the church. Or in the Acts of the Apostles, when we hear about the conversion of Saul. Saul hears the voice. "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul was going to persecute the church of Jesus, the disciples, the followers of Jesus. But Jesus didn't say that. He said, "Why are you persecuting me?" Again, how close the identification between Christ and his mystical body. I'm standing here in the great church of San Clemente in Rome. Behind me is a 12th century mosaic. I think it's the most beautiful depiction of what I'm talking about, this mystical, organic quality of the church. See the cross of Christ? On it are the 12 doves, symbolic of the 12 apostles who will go out with the message of Christ to all the world. But then look, growing from the cross, swirling around the cross, all those vines and branches and leaves, all that life, that's the organism of the mystical body of Jesus. That's all the people joined to Christ across the ages. And if I can press that natural metaphor, the church is meant to gather not just the people of the world. It's meant in some mystical way to gather all of creation, all of nature around the energy of Christ. St. Joan of Arc at her trial was being interrogated, and she said this, "About Jesus Christ and the church, I know this. They are simply one thing, and we shouldn't complicate the matter." The church is not a club, it's an organism. So all of us who are baptized are connected to each other like cells in a body. And so if we're the mystical body, then when someone's getting kicked around, that hurts me. That affects me. I can't say that's your problem. It has to be our problem. The Eucharist is the mystical body. The Eucharist is the sacrament of the mystical body. Therefore, receiving the Eucharist makes you more attuned to these disruptions of justice.
Not just symbolically.
When
you receive the Eucharist.
No, the Eucharist is the real presence of Jesus. So and that's why when you eat and drink the body and blood of Christ, you're becoming conformed to his body and blood. I mean, you're becoming more integrated into the mystical body. And therefore, Eucharist should give you a heightened sense of justice. And that's what you see in Dorothy Day very clearly. She spent a lot of time in front of the Blessed Sacrament, a lot of time at Mass, a lot of time at benedictions and retreats. And then her life was this radical commitment to the poor and to nonviolence and to ending war and all that. It's perfectly congruent. The more time you spend with the Eucharist, the more time you're going to be devoted to justice.
I don't think most realize it or think of that when they go up to communion.
No, probably not. And that's a tragedy. But I agree with Godfrey Diekman, who is actually a figure at Vatican II. He's an American Benedictine. He said the thing we lost sight of after the council was the idea of the mystical body. And prior to the council, lots of the leading theologians had a lot to say about it. And that's why from the Mass comes social justice. Social justice returns to the Mass. Those two are always linked. God is a great gathering force. God himself is a community of love. And through the act of creation, all things are linked through God to one another. What is opposed to God is a power of dissolution and division. God's response to sin was to engage in a great act of gathering in. The means he chose was the formation of a people. He called Abraham, and through him, he called the people Israel, making them distinctive, unique, peculiarly his own. He gave them laws, rituals, covenants, liturgies, a form of life meant to be pleasing to God. None of it was for the glorification of Israel, but rather that Israel might be the magnet by which the whole world would be gathered eventually unto God. Jesus was the culmination of God's plan, the fulfillment of Israel, the perfection of law, covenant, prophecy, and liturgy. He was Israel at its finest, and therefore he was the supreme divine magnet. We hear in the Gospel of John, when the Son of Man is lifted up, he will draw all people to himself. And so Jesus gathered a people. He formed the church. Outside of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus said to Simon, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." The word used there for church in the Greek is ekklesia. It comes from two other words, ek and kaleo, meaning to call out from. Therefore, when considering the church, we have to ask three basic questions. Who does the calling? What are we being called out from? And what are we being called into? In our common Western view of things, we join organizations. We decide what we want to belong to. That really isn't true of the church. In the church, someone else calls us. We are claimed and summoned, branded by Christ. Paul says, I am the slave of Christ Jesus. So Christ does the calling. What are we called out from? We're called out from what the Bible terms the world. What St. Augustine called the region of unlikeness. This means that whole realm of sin, of hatred and violence and corruption and self-absorption. That's the world we're being called out from. And what are we being called into? We're being called into the life of Christ, into God's way of being. This idea is beautifully exemplified in stone and glass right behind me. Doesn't Notre Dame look for all the world like a mighty ship moving along the Seine? The flying buttresses coming out the side, a bit like oars. And again, this is not accidental. The church is meant to look like a great ship. And the idea is, as long as we stay within its life, we find a place of haven and safety, even in the midst of the stormy world. But remember in the story of Noah, the idea is not to stay hunkered down behind the walls of the ark. Rather, the moment he was able, Noah lets the life out for the transformation of the world. So in the church, we live the life of God's beautiful community within the church, but we're not meant to remain hunkered down behind its walls. Rather, we go out from the church, now to transform the world. Consider the example of Pope John Paul II. Young Karol Wojtyła came here to Krakow, to the Jagiellonian University, at the age of 19. He commenced his studies in September of 1939, the very moment when the Nazis invaded Poland. The invaders almost immediately decapitated Polish society. They imprisoned or killed off the Polish intelligentsia. What did Karol Wojtyła do? Well, he hunkered down. He joined the underground seminary of Cardinal Sapieha, but he also gathered together with a small group of friends. They called themselves the Rhapsodic Theater. Behind closed doors and shuttered windows, they recited the great works of Polish poetry and literature and drama. But they were doing much more than preserving Polish literature. Because ingredient in those texts was the Catholic faith. They were preserving those ideas about God, about human dignity, about the freedom of the human person. When the war ended, the Nazis were succeeded by the communists, and young Father Wojtyła was forced once again to hunker down. He gathered around him small groups of students. He taught them in classrooms, but also in these fields and woods around here on kayaking and hiking trips. He formed them in Catholic spirituality, in the traditions of Catholic prayer and Catholic theology. He shared with them the treasures of the tradition. And then the propitious moment arrived. That young priest, now come of age as Pope John Paul II, returned here to Poland, and he then unleashed the life that he had preserved. In his great speeches and sermons, he spoke the truths of God, of human life, of human rights and freedom. And it's as though he gave a signal to those young people he had formed. They were now come of age as journalists and teachers and writers and business people. He said, let what you have learned now invade the society. And we saw the effect that it had. It transfigured not only Poland, but eventually the world. Just like Noah, who hunkered down on the ark during a time of the flood, but then when the moment arrived, allowed that life to be released for the transfiguration of the world. So John Paul II, hunkered down, yes, but we're never meant to crouch defensively behind our walls. We're meant to flood the world with the life that we preserved. That's the task. That's the mission of a church. According to the Creed, the Church has 4 basic marks or characteristics. The Church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Let's take the first one first. The Church is one because God is one. Go back to the 6th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. You find this great prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is Lord alone. That's called the Shema. It sums up that great monotheistic belief of the biblical Jews. There's a Christian version of the Shema. It's the very first line of the Creed. Credo in unum Deum. I believe in one God. Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, has commented, both the Shema and the Credo are subversive statements. Because when we say we believe in one God, we are disempowering all other false claimants to deity. We're saying that no president, no prime minister, no culture, no country, no ideology is God. There's only one God. Now the Church is the vehicle by which the one God wants to draw all people to unity with himself. That's why Jesus prayed at the Last Supper, Father, that they might be one as you and I are one. Now, I realize, especially for us today, this stress on unity can seem problematic. we've seen the danger of excessive unity. It's totalitarianism. In fact, in the terrible ideologies of the last century, we saw this dark, destructive side of the call to unity. Well, the church throughout the ages at its best has had a very creative way of dealing with this problem. And it has to do with Jesus. Jesus is not simply one figure among many, not one prophet in a long line of prophets. But he is himself the very Logos of God. That means the very mind of God by which God fashioned the universe. Therefore, whatever is true and good and beautiful in nature or culture can find a connection to Christ. All that's good and true and beautiful in nature or culture can be drawn to him. We're standing here in the Pantheon, the most perfectly preserved of the ancient buildings of Rome, and for my money, one of the most beautiful covered spaces in the world. Pantheon, the temple to all the gods. See how beautifully it sums up the genius of paganism, that reverence for the necessities and rhythms of nature. Well, the church was able to assimilate this great space. It's now a church of St. Mary of the Martyrs. The church was able to assimilate to itself the best of the pagan culture. This calls to mind what Origen did, what Augustine did, what Ambrose did. They used the work of Plato in their theology. It speaks to me of what Thomas Aquinas did when he used the philosophy of Aristotle in his theology, when he used the work of the Jewish scholar Moses Maimonides. It calls to mind what Vatican II said, that there are rays of light, elements of truth in all the great religions of the world. Newman said, the church has the power of assimilation, like a healthy organism that's able to move into its environment, holding off what it must, but assimilating to itself what it can. So the church at its best down through the ages, drawing all that is good and true and beautiful into its own unity. The oneness of the church is not a crushing, totalitarian oneness. Rather, it is an assimilating and living unity.
When Catholics say Jesus is the one, the only one, folks say, how could you be, how could you, eliminate all these other religions or Indians who worship something else, or, the Muslims and all the rest?
But we don't. That was the whole point of my talk at the Pantheon, was that because he is the Logos, all the other logoi, the smaller expressions of God's truth, can find relation to him. So we can find rays of light. We can find elements of truth in all the great religions. We can find elements of truth in all the great philosophies. We can look at every culture and say, that's good, that's true, that's right, that's just. And Christianity can assimilate all those things to itself. So it's not an aggressive move to say, he's the only one. It's actually a very inclusive move to say, as the Logos, he's the one. But that includes everybody else to a degree. They can all find relation to him.
Well, the Muslims must say to a degree in the opposite direction.
Probably, yeah. But then we have to get down to, a really good argument. See, one thing that concerns me is we've forgotten how to have a good religious argument. The two options seem to be either bland toleration or violence. See? And there is a middle ground between we all believe different things, so what? I'll let you believe your, I believe mine. But see, we don't believe that about politics. We have good arguments about politics. If I'm a Democrat and you're a Republican, I want to convince you, I'll have a good argument with you. And the options aren't bland indifference or violence. We find a way to actually have an argument. I want to recover a way for religious people to have an argument that's not just bland toleration, and it's not killing each other. Look at Thomas Aquinas. He figured out how to do it. Thomas Aquinas argues very effectively with a whole range: Jews, Muslims, pagans, non-believers, everybody. That's the model. The church is holy because Christ is holy, and the church is Christ's mystical body. In its traditions, in its scriptures, in its liturgy, in its sacraments, especially the Eucharist, in its art and architecture, in the lives of its saints, in its apostolic governance. The Church bears the holiness of Christ to the world. This is the Church's entire purpose, to make saints, to make people holy. Everything it is, everything it has, is meant to produce that end. In this sense, the Church is always the New Jerusalem. It's always the fountain of living water. It's always the spotless bride of Christ. What about the far less than holy things that people have done in the name of the Church over the centuries? One hears over and again about the Crusades, the Inquisition, the persecution of Galileo, the opposition to modern political reforms, institutional corruption, too much money and worldly preoccupation, and in recent years, the abuse of children by some priests and the countenancing of this by some bishops. Given that litany of abuses, how can we possibly speak of the Church as holy? To say that the Church is holy is not to deny for a minute that it's filled with sinners. To say that the Church is holy is not to deny for a minute that Church people, even of the highest rank, have done cruel, stupid, and sinful things. Was St. Bernard wrong, even sinful, to preach the Second Crusade? Yes. Was the Church wrong, even sinful, when in collusion with the Spanish government it launched the Inquisition? Yes. Were a number of popes wrong, even sinful, in their implicit support of slavery? Yes. Were a disturbing number of priests and bishops wrong, even sinful, in their contribution to the sex abuse scandal? Yes. But none of this gainsays that the Church is holy, that the Church is a bearer of grace. In the 4th century, St. Augustine battled the Donatists. The Donatists had said that only spiritually and morally worthy ministers